Okay, we actually gave this class once before, about a year and a half ago, maybe more. So there was only one guy here at that time. There was 4 guys in the yeshiva at the time, but there was only one present, so I don't think he minds review either. And then the class was titled From Moshe to Moshe Feinstein. And then there was a second title, From Moshe to Moshe David. We had a student at the time, his name was Moshe David. The idea is, how do we get from Moses, from Moshe Rabbeinu, who got the Torah on Har Sinai, in the holy mountain, to decide law today? Moshe Feinstein is one of the most well-respected codifiers of the last generation, right? He was prominent especially in the 80s, but in the 70s and the 60s. He lived in New York City, he had a yeshiva, and he would answer a lot of contemporary halachic questions. There were others as well, but I felt like it went well because there was a concept of from Moshe to Moshe, like Echad Kamoshe. They said about the Rambam, who was also along these lines of Moshe's, that from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until Moshe, Maimonides, the Rambam, nobody stood up as great and as worthy as Moshe. Maimonides, right? From the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, until Moses Maimonides, there was not somebody who stood up with that stature. They said it again, and it's on the tombstone of the Ramah. The Ramah, as we'll see soon as well, was a codifier about 400 years after the Rambam. And they said about him as well, his name was also Moshe. They said, Moshe the Moshe, like Echad Kamoshe, from Moshe, and they meant from Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, until the Ramah, Moshe Isserlis, there was not one like Moses. So I wanted to add from Moshe to Moshe Feinstein. And I won't say that like Echad Kamoshe, like Moshe Feinstein was not maybe the ultimate tzaddik and leader of the generation, but in terms of halachic authority, so we'll carry that concept. And to Moshe David, who was a student in the yeshiva, meaning how do we get to our day-to-day practical lives? Halachically, the law, Jewish law, the genealogy of it, the evolution of it, from Har Sinai until today. So the shir is broken up into 2 major parts, and the second part has 2 parts. And the first part is just getting through the historical chain, and the second part is how decisions were actually made along the way. Okay, historical chain. So we'll read from the one book that I didn't bring here. See, you want to grab me this? Oh, this is good. In the middle of benching, can't grab me. Want to grab a sitter? Here's it. Perfect. You can say it in English. Thank you. So there's what for us is a famous Mishnah. We'll get to what a Mishnah is as well along the way. But a famous Mishnah because the accepted custom is to learn Pirkei Avos, translated as the ethics of our fathers, the teachings of behavior, good behavior, upright behavior. We read that for about half a year, every week, once a week, we learn a chapter. And each chapter, the first chapter, the whole book starts with, who knows what it starts with?
Moses received the Torah from Sinai, he's passing the Yeshua.
Yeah, Moses received the Torah from Sinai, at the mountain, and passed it on to Yeshua to the elders to the prophets passed it on to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly said 3 things, etc. But a chain of events of how the tradition was passed down. It's known that Moshe on Har Sinai, he received the written Torah and the oral Torah. And the oral Torah was also, the written Torah was written down, and it was transmitted like that, written copies throughout all the generations. Moshe himself wrote it down. The oral Torah was also received on Har Sinai, and was transmitted generation to generation, and that's what we just read over there. We would look in, I have also in English, we would look in the Rambam's introduction to one of his magnum opus, maybe the book of the Rambam, which is called Sefer Yad Chazaka, 14 books set up to describe all law from the time of the giving of the Torah through the time when Mashiach will come speedily in our day, immediately. He set out all of the laws, practical laws. And he said some amazing things in this book, including the evolution, like we said. What's the tradition? Who did it go from? So it starts by quoting this Mishnah that we just read. says, just make sure I got the right place. The mitzvahs given to Moshe on Har Sinai were given with their explanation. So the Torah refers to the written law, and the mitzvah is the oral law. Moshe, our teacher, personally transcribed the entire Torah before he died. He gave a Torah scroll to each tribe, of which there were 12, of course, and placed another, a 13th one, in the ark, the holy ark. It says, even though the oral law was not transcribed, Moshe Rabbeinu taught it in its entirety in his court to the 70 elders. Elazar, Pinchas, and Yoshua, who were in the time of Moshe, and all the stories that we're reading right now in our parshas, in our portions of the Torah, they received the tradition from Moshe. And then it goes on and it lists who gave it to who, like we just read in the Mishnah. It's about 6 pages long of a of the chain of events. If anybody else has a cell phone, maybe you can put it on vibrate. Everybody else has cell phones. Maybe they could be on vibrate. Then at the end of that, he lists, just after telling you who the tradition was, he tells you, Rav Ashi, so this, he goes backwards. Rav Ashi got it from Rava, Rava got it from Rabba, Rabba from Rav Huda from etc., 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 until he goes through the prophet, backwards to the kings and the prophets, until he gets back to Moshe Rabbeinu and tells you person to person who got the tradition from who were the teachers and students. Everything is teacher and student. Alright, I'll leave that. At the end of this, he says a very interesting thing, which will be very relevant for us. He says, at some point, everything started to get a little bit confused. We'll see in a minute, we'll get right into the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, the person who began to write down the oral law. Right? It's still called the oral law because it was originally not meant to be written down. It was not written down. It was transmitted mouth, person to person, like we just read. Moshe Maimonides, the Rambam, at some point came and said, therefore, things have gotten a little bit hectic around town, and therefore I've girded my loins. I added that part. The Rambam didn't say hectic around town. It says, and I, Moses, the son of Maimon, the Rambam, of Spain, I relied upon the rock, blessed be he. I contemplated all the texts and sought to compose a work which would include the conclusions derived from all of these texts regarding the forbidden and the permitted, the impure and the pure, and the remainder of the Torah's laws in a clear and concise terms, so that the entire oral law can be organized in each person's mouth without questions or objections. And then he says, to summarize, that a person, the intent of this text is that a person will not need another text at all with regard to any Jewish law. Rather, this text will be a compilation of the entire oral law, including also the ordinances, customs, and decrees. They were enacted from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until the completion of the Gemara, the Talmud. And therefore I've called it Mishnah Torah, the second to the Torah. A person should first study the written law, and then study this text and comprehend the entire oral law. Strong words. Many people took exception to that. They did not like the Rambam came to make a compilation like this. We'll get back a little bit to the Rambam style in a moment.
That's the one we study every day?
That's the Rambam that we study every day. In the beginning of every the cycle, so we read the introduction as well. You read the chain of events, who's teacher, who was the student, and those words as well.
Every cycle, it's like 53 years old.
Right, the cycles are right. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, we mentioned before, he compiled the Mishnah. The Mishnah was a collection of teachings from the time that the Torah was given. The Torah was given in 2448, which is, I didn't write down the actual, what might compute better in our minds, but that's about 3,330 and 23 years ago. Avraham Avinu was born in 1948, about 500 years, almost exactly 500 years before that. He was what began the 2,000 years of Torah. There was the 2,000 years of creation, 2,000 years of Torah, and 2,000 years of Mashiach. We'll get back to that later. But 500 years after Avraham Avinu was born, the Torah was given Har Sinai. Avraham Avinu had learned Torah, but the event of Har Sinai is actually explained in other places what's the significance of the Jewish people actually receiving the Torah. But it was received, How many years was it?
From Moshe?
From Avraham to Moshe? 500 years. From Avraham Avinu to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe was already 80 when they got the Torah, but that's when the Torah was received. From that time, so we said the law was supposed to be kept as an oral tradition, meant to be passed on from teacher to student. And the fact of the matter is, today, when we look at the Gemara, and we all started learning it in the last few days, and whoever had experience previously or whatever, we see that it's still meant to be teacher to student. We showed how they kept the text in a certain fashion that you can't just pick it up and get into it. Today, so they give you help books. There's the art school did amazing favors for people who do not have the background, did not have the opportunity. A lot of people come, Bali Tshuva, they want to learn the text, and there's no way to get into it without a teacher. So they gave you an ability to get into the concept, understand them, they explain them on the paper, but they still kept one side of the book exactly like it's been for the last 500 years. Right? It's meant to be given teacher to student, so that even though there's ambiguity from teacher to student, there's much less than trying to understand the text. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, up until him, and he compiled the Mishnah, wrote it down, edited it in the year 200. That's to their count, which is about the year 3960. Okay, so this is already 1,500 years after the Torah was given. From that time, there was discussions of after the time of the prophets and after the times of the kings, there was a group of rabbis called the Tanoim. They were the early Mishnaic rabbis. What ends up being quoted, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was amongst the last of them, and he compiled all the teachings of the previous several hundred years into a book called the Mishnah, and he organized it into 6 orders, 6 compartments. One was it was called Zerayim. It was all the laws that had to do with agriculture and working the land, laws like tithing, giving the first fruits, letting the land rest for a year, anything agricultural.
You said those books were last for
That was the first how he started the book. The Rambam explains, one of his major works also is an introduction to all the Mishnayos and all the Mishnah, and he writes why everything is ordered the way it is, why it started with Zerayim. It's actually very interesting.
That was the first section of the Mishnah. That was the first subject of the Mishnah.
First subject, yeah. It actually starts, interestingly enough, with the tractate on brachos. Right? The whole thing is about working the land and produce, and it starts with brachos. The Rambam discusses that as well. And actually, brachos starts with Shema. All been explained over the last several thousand years. The next order was Moyed, which deals with all the special times we have. It deals with Shabbos, and it deals with the Yomim Tovim are mentioned over there, right? All the holidays like Pesach is in Moyed, etc. Then was Nezikin, damages, which is what we started. This concept of whether you're allowed to take the law into your own hands or not is in this Seder, the order of Nezikin, of damages, law, civil law. Then there was Nashim. Nashim was marital relationships between man and woman, and all the things that govern the relationship between man and woman. Then there was Kodashim, which is the laws of sacrifices. And the final order was Taharis. Taharis was Tuma and Tahara, impurities. It's all spiritual things. Okay, so why did the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi decide to write down the oral law? Right, it's the oral law. It was already now 1,500 years, nothing was written down. So he saw that the Jews were beginning to spread out. There was exiles. It was after the destruction already of the second Beis HaMikdash, the second holy temple in Jerusalem. And the intellectual powers were also waning. People had all this amazing hundreds and thousands, almost 1,500 years of material memorized. And it was given word of mouth. The only thing they had was notes. People were allowed to take certain notes. And there was actually later a discrepancy whether you're allowed to keep the notes or you had to bury them. You take notes to help you to understand something, but were you allowed to keep a note? It was oral. It had to be an oral Torah. The most you had was notes. Nothing was allowed to be written down. But when the intellectual capacity seemed to be dropping, especially with the Jews always being on the run and persecuted. So he said, Eis Lasi, he quoted a verse in Tehillim, Eis Lasi Hashem, Mefer Torah. Even though it's supposed to be a written law, sometimes there comes a time to do something for the sake of God, and we have to kind of...
Even in oral law. So even though it's supposed to be a written law.
What did I say?
You said it's supposed to be a written law.
It's supposed to be an oral law. You play that back. Now I can't deny it. It was supposed to be an oral law and never to be written, but because of the time that we were in, for the sake of the Torah itself, he took upon himself to say we have to go against the Torah. And it was a very radical move. And a lot of people did not like it at the time.
So why was it specifically the one allowed to write anything and it wasn't supposed to be only oral? Why was that?
That's how God gave it. I mean, because again, I think
that was a halacha kind of before.
Yeah, absolutely. It could not be written down, and I think it has to do with the ambiguity that happens in a text. You know, I tell you, I see today somebody picks up a text and they think, wow, this is great. It justifies everything I've been thinking up till today.
Yeah.
But what does it really say? You know, you have to have somebody there who keeps your integrity in the text that you're learning.
But doesn't it say that it's all like you can't like, I know it's this word, but it's at least like halacha. You can't like just change something. You think, okay, well it's a good whatever, however good the reason says.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, it's left to our understanding. When it's an oral tradition, so the teacher makes sure that the student gets what it says. And doesn't.
No, I know, but I mean like the fact that he broke it, like he said, okay, we're going to break this halacha. Doesn't it say like you can't do that?
That's why people took exception with what he did. But at the same time, so he brought this verse. Not everybody can bring this verse and say, you know what, it's a time to do something radical for God's sake. We're going to break the Torah for God's sake. And people didn't think he had the power to do that either. But look who was right. 2,000 years later, 1,800 years later, we have the Mishnah, we have the Talmud, we have Halacha. We know how to live like Jews because Rabbi and Nasi decided that this was the way to go.
It just seemed like a definition of false prophet, isn't it?
No, God forbid. It's an idea of it itself was the Torah. To keep the Torah demanded kind of breaking the Torah for a moment. Not an easy thing. Okay. After Rabbi Nasi, at the same time Rabbi Nasi, there was so he compiled the Mishnah. Whatever was left out in the several hundred years of discussion was called a Braisa. We see many times in the Gemara. The Talmud is made up of the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Gemara is a discussion. It was printed, there was two Gemaras. There's a Gemara of Yerushalayim, it's called Talmud Yerushalmi. It's actually in Tiberia, but since it was in Israel, the main heart of Israel's Yerushalayim was called Talmud Yerushalmi. And the Talmud Bavli. The Talmud Yerushalmi was put together by Rabbi Yochanan in the year 400. You know, if we're going by 2000, that kind of count. 1,500, 1,600 years ago. 100 years later, Rav Ashi and Rav Ami, who were living in Bavel, they put together the Talmud Bavel. And the distinction between the two is clear. When you open, if a person would open Talmud Yerushalmi, which we don't learn in general, it's not the first book that we take in terms of sitting and learning in yeshivas. Seasoned veterans and learners can open up the Talmud Yerushalmi. But the Talmud Bavli is much more... The Talmud Yerushalmi is very straight. It discusses a Mishnah and tells you this is what it means. We learned last year in Baba Kama, we looked for an answer of what the Mishnah says. There is some damage where you only pay half damages, and we looked for about 4 pages to try and find out what it is. Right? We said it can't be this thing, it can't be that thing. We went back and forth. I opened up the Talmud Yerushalmi. The first words are, this is the half damages. Right? It doesn't come from a point of darkness, it comes from a point of direct. Nonetheless, our main thing to learn is Talmud Bavli, and all the law, that if there's ever a discrepancy between Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi, the law goes according to Talmud Bavli. The Gemara would bring Braisas. These were teachings also from the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the Tanoim, the early Mishnaic rabbis, as opposed to Amorayim. The Gemara rabbis were called Amorayim. Okay, they were the later rabbis. These early rabbis are also brought inside the Gemara things that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi left out. We've seen already in the few classes that we had in the last couple of days that a Braisa still has an amazing power compared to the later generation. It would be brought as a proof text, but it did not have the same power as a Mishnah. Anything that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi codified and put inside the Mishnayos if a Braisa would contradict that, usually the Braisa would be thrown away, disregarded as having had a mistake. Right? These things were recorded after, even when they were written down, they were recorded my generation without a printing press. So there could be corrupted texts along the way, memorization and etc. Okay. At the
tractates were there
in the how many tractates? There were 6 orders. I'm not sure how many tractates. I think 24. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on
like
that.
Psachim and Kudashim we said in the beginning, like the first one was like
6.
Oh, that's 6.
Okay, at the same time,
That's a tractate, sorry. That's a tractate.
that's a Seder. Tractate would be brachas under there.
That's like within
At the same time, the Midrashim began. There were Midrashim written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was one of the greatest of the Tanaim, the original Mishnaic rabbis. Those were the Midrashei Halacha. They were Midrashim whose they were like the Gemara in the sense that they were there to clarify for us where the halachas were drawn out from the Torah. Later, several hundred years later, more closer to the time of the Gemara, a couple hundred years later, was Midrashei Agadata, which is probably a favorite amongst people who, especially alone, people who like to pick up books and read what's going on in the parsha and read all the amazing stories. Those all came from about 1600 years ago. Later there were even more midrashim, like there's Yalkut Shimoni is probably the most famous one. These were from 1,000 years after the original midrashim. Even the times of the Rishonim, who we'll get back to in a minute. Midrashim that were still explaining the depths and the ethical lessons we learned from the Torah, the tradition that we had. They were not written down until about 900 years ago. And that was the close of all the midrashim. After the Gemara, so there was a short time period of the Savuroi, the Rabbanan Savuroi. They lasted about 90 years. I don't think anybody really knows what their major accomplishment was. We know that they existed. We know that they were on the border between the Amoraim, the close of the Gemara, and the Gorenstein, who would be immediately following the Savuroi. And they had some prominent time in history where they were locked off to say this was their time. And I can't tell you, we have no text from them, and I can't tell you what their major accomplishments were, but they are recorded in history as having their own time period. Very short stint, 90 years. Right after that was the Gorenstein. The Gorenstein period, also we don't have so many writings from, but we do see in the Rishonim, which is the next generation. From the Gorenstein lasted from about 600 till about 900. And again, from now on I'm working so we can get we can relate to, in our thoughts, how many years ago it was. I start telling you 4,200. I don't know if people would get it so quickly.
What was after Amoraim?
The Amoraim were the close of the Gemara.
Yeah.
And then there was a short period called Rabbanan Savuroi, and then the Gorenstein. The Gorenstein period lasted a few hundred years.
What is the
Gorenstein.
No, before that.
Rabbanan Savuroi. The Gorenstein lasted for a few hundred years. We do not have many writings. We do have some ethical writings of Rav Sadia Gaon and the like. They wrote a lot, they clarified a lot of what was going on inside the Talmud, but most of that we have through the next time period, the Rishonim. The Rishonim time period is probably it's every time period when you look at it is the main time period. The Rishonim have a very prominent position. They were the ones who clarified for all of time in a much more modern day language what the Talmud was saying. And these are guys who everybody's heard of, I think. If you sat for a few minutes in a class, so you have Rashi. Rashi is on almost every page of the Gemara, minus a couple, and that's several thousand pages. He's on every page of Tanakh. He's a commentator in Midrash. Rashi is everywhere. Rashi is from that time period of the Rishonim. The Rambam, who we mentioned before, Maimonides, is from that time period of the Rishonim. Clarified the law of what is the Gemara telling us. There's the Rosh and the Rif, and there's several others. I will mention the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh again, because they will be the ones who we're going to lean on most heavily in terms of how we decide the law today. Okay, after the Rishonim, so you have the Achronim. The Achronim time period began somewhere around 1300, right at the end of the Rishonim. The early Achronim, like in every time period, were the late. Again, I'll tell you what the significance is of the breakup in the next part of the class. But the early Achronim, as in every one of the time periods, shared the fact that they were late Rishonim. We have this example along the way in the Mishnah, between the Mishnah and the Gemara, between the Gemara and the Rabbanan Savurai, between the Gorenstein and the Rishonim, between the Rishonim, they bleed together. The significance of that I'll leave for a moment. But these are, significantly begin with the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law. Perhaps even earlier the Tur, who was the basis of the Shulchan Aruch. Somebody came along after all these thousands of years from the time that the Gemara was closed. And now we had, how many years was it? It was about, from the Tur, it was about 900 years. 900 years from the close of the Gemara, or 800 years, until the Tur came. The Tur came and he said, great, I see all of what the Rishonim, the last several hundred years, did based on the Gorenstein and based on the Rabbanan Savurai. They all explained what the Gemara means, but there were discrepancies between them. There were arguments, as any two good Jews get together, they have to argue. So there were many arguments along the way about how do we clearly understand what this Gemara is trying to say. And the Tur came along and he basically made a compilation. He showed what all the greatest of the generations, and especially the one preceding himself, how they felt the true meaning of the Gemara is for the law. Any interpretation by one of these great geniuses is a true interpretation. Elu elu divrei Elokim Chaim. These and these are the laws, the words of the living God. It's true. It's a part of Torah. But what do they feel like was the ultimate truth? What is the Gemara trying to tell us? How we're supposed to act? The Rishonim were, in general, the few hundred people who were responsible for that. The Tur came, narrowed them down to a few, just like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did before. How many years earlier? About 1100 years earlier, when he created the Mishnah. And he put them all in a list. He said, this is this guy's opinion, this is this guy's opinion, and this is what Avi Adeni HaRash, my father, my master, the Rosh, who was one of the later Rishonim, is Rabbeinu Asher, who I mentioned before as well. This is what he felt is the law. After the Tur came the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch said, you know what, it's all well and good that the Tur put everything together, all the major opinions, but we don't know what the law is when we look at the Tur. So he wrote a major work called the Beis Yosef. Now this is Rabbi Yosef Karo, whose shul from 500 years ago is 2 flights that way. Just walk down the stairs over there, you get to his shul. He lived in Sfat in the end of his life, and here he compiled finished one and compiled the other of his great works. One is the Beis Yosef on the Tur. The lengthy explanation, he opened the Tur back up and showed where all these Rishonim were coming from. And I'll tell you the significance of that again in the next part. And then he wrote his own book where he made a clear decision in law. This is how a Jew is supposed to act. It all went well, except that he leaned towards his traditions, which he came from Sephardi countries. So Moshe Explaining, the Ramah, who I mentioned before in the beginning of this class, so he brought all the tradition from going back in his generations, which was an Ashkenazic tradition, and he had seen the work of the Beis Yosef, of Rabbi Yosef Karo, on the Tur, and he had written his own work like that. And his great humility, this is a tremendous, I'm going to show you later, but here we have. This is what the Tur did. The Tur took the couple thousand years that came before him, especially from the close of the Gemara, 900 years, and he put all of the people, whatever decisions that they made, they understood how the Gemara worked. He wrote them. This is in relation to the laws of milk and meat. So he writes a brief thing, a compilation of what the major opinions were to the day. This is the Beis Yosef. Beis Yosef is on the inside. So he sometimes can get actually very lengthy, just to explain the few words of the opinions that were brought in the Tur. Okay? He wrote this amazing compilation to explain, so that when we look at the Tur, we know where everybody's coming from. We can pick up this book and we can get into the depths of the law. I'll give you an example at the way end of the evolution of one law that I think is fairly interesting.
So you're saying the Kiddushim in the Torah is a lot from Rabbi Yosef, and also that.
So here the Beis Yosef wrote his long explanation of the Tur, but the Ramah, who I mentioned before, is the Ashkenazi codifier. He had written his own. He had done the same work. They lived in the same time period. He was a lot younger than the Beis Yosef, but equally respected. When he was 20 years old, he became the Rav of Krakow. Krakow, the Moshe Explaining, the Ramah. I'll tell you more about him in a second. He became in terms of Halacha, he became the Rav of Krakow. He was 20. He was like like a young guy, like fresh off the boat kind of thing, you know? And Krakow at the time was like the Torah center of the world. And there were great Torah giants there. And many people did not appreciate that this young guy became the Rav of their town. So they came to him all the time and they would try to test him and ask him all these difficult questions, and he would pass all the tests. So that was the Ramah. The Ramah had written his own work exactly like the Beis Yosef, but according to his traditions, according to what he received as the true tradition they were in different countries, right? When he saw the Beis Yosef's book, he was so impressed. He said, I don't need to write mine. I'm just going to write an addendum to the Beis Yosef. I'm going to write an addendum to this long book. I'm going to put in what are the differences. In lots of places, most places, it's very, very much the same. But wherever we decided a little differently, that our custom is a little different than his, I'm just going to put that in a note on his book. So that's what he did. It's called the Dark Moshe. Instead of writing these long things here, so he wrote a much shorter thing. Usually it's much shorter than this as well. This is Dark Moshe on this page. Sometimes he doesn't say anything at all. Here, this is the Dark Moshe on this long piece, right? You see? So he had written long pieces like that as well, but in his great humility he said, you know what, Rabbi Yosef Karo did a wonderful job. I don't need to touch anything. I'll just show where the differences are. Later, Rabbi Yosef Karo, when he decided the Halacha, after he wrote that long explanation of the Torah, he wrote his own, something that looks very similar to the Torah today. This is not the guy we were looking at before. This is Rabbi Yosef Karo. He took everything that he wrote after he explained what the Torah was, and he weeded through what is the ultimate, how do we decide the law, and he wrote it here. The Ramah had done the same thing as well on his book. But the Ramah, again, in his great humility, he wrote what later became the Haggah, the note. He put his notes. It's the more like Rashi script, and he's again much smaller, much more humble position, but writing all of the differences in tradition that he had from Rabbi Yosef Karo.
So the first work of Yosef Karo was the Pirushim on the Torah.
The first work,
Yosef.
He had an earlier work, which I'll mention again later.
That's the one we're talking about now.
Yeah, that's the earlier one. The Shulchan Aruch.
That's the Shulchan.
Yeah, I showed you two. One was the Tur, and the Tur has a commentary. There's a few, but the major commentary is the Beis Yosef, Yosef Karo's commentary. And then I showed you the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Code of Law.
That's it, right?
Right. This actually has both in it. This one. Okay. After that, so you had those. Then you had those were the late Rishonim, more properly the beginning of the Achronim. Then you had a bunch of Achronim who came to explain now the Shulchan Aruch. So those guys, if you saw when I pointed out, there's a bunch of people on the side of his page as well. This is the Rabbi Yosef Karo when he decided the law. And some people took exception or explained what they felt like was unexplained, or ambiguities in his text had to be explained. And that's what all these guys are doing over here. And there's a lot more. These are Achronim, right? Then the Achronim took on a later stage. It became the later Achronim. These were guys like the Alter Rebbe, the Chasam Sofer, around Chasam Sofer Street. Alter Rebbe is the first Rebbe of Chabad. He wrote also a Shulchan Aruch. Who else in that time period? Rabbi Kiva Eger, the Lavush, amazing Torah personalities in those generations as well, that came after the close of the setup of the Shulchan Aruch and continued to further the work of deciding and showing us a much more simple form of what's the law.
Shulchan Aruch was in the second half of the
It's way early, the very beginning of the Achronim Shulchan Aruch. Yeah? The Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is in the second half of the Achronim.
But the Hina Achronim, the Shulchan Aruch, it's saying it's straight after Rabbi Yosef and the Torah, and until Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch.
One more time? I didn't hear you.
Yosef Karo wrote the Yosef,
right.
And then Shulchan Aruch wrote the Shulchan Aruch.
Yeah.
And then after the Pirushim came on the Shulchan Aruch and also the Rabbi Yosef.
That's right. after that, so you have pretty much the last several hundred or 140 up to 150 years maximum, who are called usually they're called the Achronim. The Achronim means the later ones. Yeah, the Rishonim are the first ones, the Achronim are the afterwards ones. Right? You don't get past the Achronim. We'll be on the Achronim until Mashiach comes right away. Right? But nonetheless, you have this some people call them the Achrei Achronim, after the later ones. And we don't get past this. I can't imagine. If it goes on, what it's going to be? Achrei Achronim. These are the after the later ones. And what's the chiddush of this generation in Halacha? It's an amazing thing. Everything was laid out before us from the time, and we'll go through it again. Everything was laid out from the time that Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, from all the conversations that happened until we got to the Mishnah and they were recorded. The Gemara explaining the Mishnah, the Gorenim and the Rishonim explaining the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch coming and codifying and making it, this is the law, how we finally, a psak, by the way, to psak means to decide the law, but it means to stop. That even though we can keep going forever with amazing insights into these laws, and it's worthwhile in learning, but eventually we have to decide and know what the law is and close off any other kind of stream of consciousness thought in terms of Torah. So when the Yosef Karo came, he made it psak, so he closed the door on whatever happened before, and we'll get into that again a little more. But when we got to our generation, which is the technological boom of existence, things have changed in our lives so drastically in the last 150 years. In the time when we're already past now all the greatest greats we could ever imagine. We're past, like we said, the Tanaim, the Amoraim, the Shayim, all these amazing minds and the Achronim, who again are maybe not equal, but equal in their own right, amazing personalities and geniuses. And clarity of thought and expression and teaching. And now we got to our generation. What's the innovation of our generation? Applying all of that. Finding and understanding and applying it to things like electricity. Things like the fact that the world changed. We're up at night. We used to sleep all night. The world keeps going all night long now. Yeah? Businesses can run at night. To things like travel. To things like microwaves and cooking, if cooking is allowed on Shabbos or not. We'll get back to that one particularly. So that's what the Achronim and the Achrei Achronim did. They made kitzurim, they made much more shorter books. Instead of writing like Rashi on the whole Torah, or like the Shulchan Aruch codifying every law that you can possibly imagine, they take primarily a few subjects, go into them in a lot of depth, and apply them to modern day standards of living. And how do we relate to pure Torah concepts to innovations in our everyday life? Okay, that's part one. Just the simple evolution in terms of time and tradition. But how does it work? How do things get decided? So we'll start with the Rambam. The Rambam writes like this.
So which book is the Rambam?
Which book of the Rambam?
Which book is the Rambam?
The Rambam is a Rishonim. Okay. The Rambam writes like this. Based on a Golda Shadash Ba'achas in the Midas, the great court who expounded in one of the ways that was given with the Torah to understand how to derive law from the Torah, according to what seemed to them the right way, that this is the law and they decided this is how we're supposed to behave. And afterwards, in later generation, came a new court, and it seemed to them a different reason, different ideas behind what was being studied, which would contradict the law that was decided in the previous generation. Behold, they can contradict, they can break down the original learning, and they will decide the law according to how they see fit. Right? There's a concept that says you only have the judge in your generation. It says Yiftach Kedera Kamesha B'Dei. Yiftach is a great judge, one of the great leaders of Israel, but we only have the simple meaning of that is he's not like Moshe Rabbeinu. But nonetheless, in his generation, we have to go. The Torah says we have to go to the leader of our generation. If he feels that his court feels like something was misinterpreted in the previous generation, he can actually change it. That's what the Rambam says. Because it says, go to the judge who will be in your days, in those days. You're not obligated to go according to anybody but the Beis Din in your generation. The law of the ways decided in your generation. The next halacha doesn't contradict this, but if a decree was made in any generation along the way, so we can't just come and uproot it. So it's not a free-for-all. It's not just how we feel as rabbis in a certain generation that we can change the law. But why am I bringing the first halacha? Because the significance is it sounds like we can change the law. So the Kesef Mishnah of Yosef Karo, we mentioned before, he wrote the Beis Yosef and he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. So his first amazing work was a long explanation of the Rambam. And the Kesef Mishnah writes like this. If you're going to ask, why do we find that no Amoraim argue with Tanaim? Right? The Amoraim were the later generation of the Gemara as opposed to the Mishnaic Tanaim. If you're going to ask, why do no Amoraim argue with the Tanaim? The Habachol Dufta, Makshina La'amoira, and not only that, in every place in the Gemara we find where we bring a question to on the Amoira, on the later rabbi, from a Mishnah or from a Brisa, which were from previous generational teachings. Right? And then the only way we can answer, how could he say something against this explicit Mishnah or Brisa, against the previous source text from previous generation? We say, oh, he held like a different rabbi. Right? So the Rambam is saying that we have the ability in a later generation to contradict if we understand differently what a previous generation said. Why do we find nowhere that a later generation actually argues with the previous generation? Right? Not only what we don't find, we find that if it seems like he does, we want to discard him. Unless we can find somebody that held like him in a previous generation. Right? We're all familiar with that in the Gemara classes, right?
Yeah.
So he says, maybe we can hold like this. Maybe we could say like this as the Kesef Mishnah. From the time that the Mishnah was closed, the later generations all accepted upon themselves. It's not that they're not allowed, but they accepted upon themselves not to argue with the previous generation. And also they did this when the Gemara was closed. And nobody would come in later generations and argue with anything that was explicit in the Gemara. And we find that today. From the time that it was sealed, no person was given the ability to argue with what was written earlier. There comes a time where we say, up till here, once it was decided on the Mishnah, by the Mishnah time, that what came before, these are the main texts and the main opinions, you can't bring me from a previous generation. We accepted that upon ourselves. You can't bring me from a previous generation and say, look, I'm relying on that guy. No, Jewish people decided like this. Same thing when the Mishnah ended, and same thing when the Gemara ended, and same thing, the next person who got that power was Rabbi Yosef Karo himself, the one who wrote this Kesef Mishnah. When the Shulchan Aruch came, for the large part, when he wrote his book, nobody can come afterwards and easily say, I'm going to take from somebody in the previous generation against what Rabbi Yosef Karo said.
So what made that a deciding factor? Like what made the deciding factor that everyone was like, okay, we can't go beyond what Yosef because
people accepted it. People accepted it as the core text, just like they did with the Mishnah and just like they did with the Talmud. They accepted the Shulchan Aruch as the core text. All Torah-abiding Jewish people all over the world learned that book, and it's very difficult. It's not totally uncommon, but it's very difficult afterwards, and it's the farther we get away for sure. When other people close to generation did not try to argue with him, it's very, very difficult to argue with him. And you can't take some previous, even you might find somewhere a previous generation before Rabbi Yosef Karo who said like you think, and go like that. No, you have to go to Rabbi Yosef Karo. That's something that's been accepted by Torah-abiding Jews all over the place. There is a concept of, within the rules of interpretation, again, which were given to us with the Torah, you do find sometimes where we can argue with the Shulchan Aruch based on the rules that were given. For instance, certain books he might not have seen. Right? If we can prove that Rabbi Yosef Karo did not see this book and this individual, and he always went like that individual, we might be able to judge law accordingly.
But going like that, it looks like really you should be like going according to the Yosef book.
But the Ramah, who was in the same generation, so he did the same thing for the Ashkenazim. Most of the time, he does not even argue with the basis.
What about Oral Torah that came after that?
They came, and most of them explained ambiguities, and sometimes there's discrepancies in what did the Shulchan Aruch mean, right? But not necessarily arguing with him. And if they did, you would find pages of an explanation of why we should not agree with the Shulchan Aruch at this point. It wasn't a simple thing. It was done sometimes, but it wasn't very simple. It was accepted as the text.
But in terms of Halacha, like in the Shulchan Aruch, like the Koshim, like one rabbi in the Koshim might not necessarily the same thing. It might be like slightly different to
right.
Yosef Karo.
Yeah.
So like that's like saying you can hold like any other Koshim or like any other rabbi.
No, then there are rules also on how to decide the law according to all these Perushim. You can't just take like everything is perfect tradition, just like it was from the time of Moshe to the Mishnah to the Talmud to the Dohanim to the Rishonim, etc. It's all based on teacher to student. You can't just, the discrepancies come sometimes in how maybe two students understood their teacher, and even then there's rules on how to decide between the students. Right? Everything has, and those rules are given from the beginning. Everything has its place. Follow?
Yeah. So, like, one more question. Like, so where does the Rabbi stand?
I'll get back to that. Okay. The Beis Yosef gave us also a rule, a principle on how he decided things. In the beginning of his long compilation on the Torah, he wrote that anywhere where the great three, and those who I mentioned before, they are the Rambam, the Rosh, the Rambam and the Rif, and the Rosh. The Rambam and the Rif were Sephardim, and the Rosh was an Ashkenazi. He held the Beis Yosef. He said, anywhere where two of those three decide a law together, I decide like them. Right? He learned how they learned the Gemara. He would bring many other Rishonim, many other people from that time period, about 900 till 1300, let's say, and to explain certain matters in clarity, and also sometimes to decide like them. But his general rule was, first of all, he was the biggest Rambam fan until the Rebbe. The Rebbe took over on what it means to be a Rambam fan, making sure that every single Jew would learn every day a piece of the Rambam. That didn't exist before the Rebbe. Nonetheless, the Beis Yosef wrote in a book of Halachic Responsa, he wrote, in Israel, we go only according to the Rambam, he meant the land of Israel, Ki hu zeh, because he is the one. He's like the great. There's nobody greater than the Rambam. He wrote these words, and he relied on the Rambam unbelievably. Nonetheless, when he decided law, most of the time he would say, if the two greats of the Rif and the Rosh, the two Sephardim, the Rif and the Rambam, the two Sephardim and the Rosh, the Ashkenazi, of those three, if two would be together against one, so no matter who the two were, the law was like the two. In the 1980s, they found just to explain how law was developed. It's not arbitrary. It's not because the majority rules. It is, but still the power of a Rav and the Shulchan Aruch to decide the law is as follows. In the 1980s, they found a later edition of the Rambam, where the Rambam actually changed his mind on a few things. So it became a big question amongst the rabbis, right? It used to be that the Rambam and the Rif were like this, and the Rosh was on the other side. But with so what did the Beis Yosef decide, or Yosef Karo decide in that context? Like the two Sephardim, right? But in the new edition, so we see the Rambam changed his mind. He went like this. He went like the other guy. So the big tumult was, how do we decide the law now? We know that we decide according to the Shulchan Aruch, right? At the same time, the Shulchan Aruch told us how he decides. He decides like the two as opposed to the one. So the Shulchan Aruch said like this because they were the two, but now the two are over here. So what do we do? So the Rebbe spoke about this, And the Rebbe said you have to understand what it means to decide the law. He said it's true that the Beis Yosef usually decided like the majority, aside from the fact that there are some exceptions to that rule. But he usually decided like the majority amongst these three. But it was the idea of a person who decides the law is not a choosing game. It's not a favorites game. He must understand. It says Torah leba shamayim. The Torah is not in the heavens. It was given to person, and a person has to decide from his own self. If he understands and he lives with the concepts in the Torah and the laws of the Torah, then he can decide the law. So ultimately when Rabbi Yosef Karo would decide the law, it was not because of the majority. He forced himself out of humility. He felt like if these two people understood one way, I can't go against it. And even if he understood like the minority, he would work himself day and night, he would work himself day and night until he understood like the majority, out of his great humility. And only then he would decide law like that. So ultimately what you come up with is even when the Rambam moves, so to speak, so the law still goes like the Shulchan Aruch. Because at the end of the day, he decided the law from his own self, not because of this rule of the majority. Follow? Yeah?
Hypothetically, your addition of the other guy to the two, if he had also all through in one camp, you think he would still be able to say what you're saying?
Yeah, it would still apply. Surely it would still apply.
2 to 1, and if
because
both of these, a new book came out, all three went one way.
That's right. It would still apply the way I just said, but it's true. It's true that there, like I said, I mentioned earlier, that sometimes they might find a text that Shulchan Aruch never saw. And if he did decide, that does become a legitimate argument in how we would decide law today. In other words, what we might actually do, if such a thing would happen, is we might actually say, well, we'll go with how the Rebbe explained, and we'll go with the Shulchan Aruch, right? But if we might be able to use the fact that there is a very large possibility that even Rabbi Yosef Karo himself would not, even if it was just 2 against 1, right, would not have decided the law as he did, because he went according to the majority, and now all 3 or 2 are on the other side.
Is there 3 to 0 to 1?
But I don't see the difference between 2 against 1 and 3 and 0 in this case, in other words, right? If his rule was he goes with the majority is now in the other place, it's the same logic that dictates that now that he went according to his own understanding, he just forced himself to understand one way, but he understood this way, so that's how he decided.
I think it's because if there was 3 to 0, was there ever a time when Yosef Karo
made stuff up?
0? Yeah.
No.
If all 3 said this, did he ever go the other way? And
right.
It's one thing to say 2 to 1, but if it's 3 to 0,
I'd have to check that out. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
No
There were times where he went with the minority. There may have been times, I'm not sure, but there may have been times where he actually did go against all 3 and went with some other. It doesn't stand out, which doesn't mean much by me that it doesn't stand out.
At the same time with that, because of all the praise he gave to the monuments and Rambam, for him, if Rambam was with everyone and he goes against them, what's that saying about his traits? Everyone is with Rambam's on one side.
Right. I hear you. Okay, but I'm just saying it's good to bring out, like again, how the development of the law would work. In that case, a Rav would be free, really, to decide in certain circumstances. He would always keep that in his back pocket, so to speak. That it's possible that yes, he would have decided different. It's possible he wouldn't. Right? So if a certain complex, ambiguous question would come his way, he might join that in to say, you know what, it's okay, do this, or it's not okay, don't do that. You follow what I'm saying?
So in a rock today,
that's right. I will get back to that in a second, how that works, that nuance. Which brings to the last part of this whole thing. Alright, I'll just give you an example. I thought I had this written in my notes here. Apparently it's in another notebook, which I don't know where it is, but I think I've got it straight today here. It says, we learn in the Gemara that cooking on Shabbos is a Torah prohibition. Right? You're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. The Gemara says that if you cook with a derivative of fire, and science guys probably thinking, what the heck's a derivative of fire? It's like all sorts of like protons and neutrons and stuff. I mean, like you have a piece of metal, and it's very hot. Yeah, from fire. If you cook from that, it's also prohibited from the Torah. The Torah says don't cook. You can't put something on the grill. You can't put something in the oven. You can't put something in boiling water. You can't put it on something that was not directly even related to the fire. Boiling water off the fire maybe would be a derivative of hot sheet metal, would be a derivative of fire, and all these things are prohibited from the Torah. Then the rabbis say also a derivative from the sun is prohibited. But this is only prohibited from the rabbis, not from the Torah. Why? As I said, cooking with the sun is totally allowed on Shabbos. In other words, they give examples. I don't know how the practicality of it is, okay? Because a derivative of the sun would be the same hot piece of metal or a hot rooftop or the ground. That's all heated up by the sun, right? You're not allowed to cook on that. The reason the rabbis gave was because it looks like cooking. In other words, if we say cooking with fire and cooking with a sheet that was heated up by a sheet of metal that was heated up by fire is exactly the same Torah prohibition. If you take me a metal sheet that was heated up by the sun, so nobody can see the difference of what was heated up by fire and heated up by the sun. And therefore, if you cook on that, it's also prohibited from the rabbis because it looks like actual Torah cooking.
It's a
Following me? Huh?
It's a fence.
It's a fence. It's a fence, that's right. But why is it only from the rabbis? Because sun is not cooking. If you could take somehow an egg, put it in a Tupperware container, put it in some real place where the sun is really beating down strong, I don't know if it's possible or not, or water in a container where the container itself does not get heated, right? Because if the container gets heated, then it's a derivative of the sun. But if the sun itself can somehow boil the water, bring it to this standard, what is called cooking by water, or it can cook that egg, or even a part of it, by the way, a part of cooking something is cooking. That is totally permitted from the Torah and the rabbis. That's not called cooking. The question would be, why not? Yeah? If I'm going to tell you that you're not allowed to cook, here's my kitchen, go in and do whatever you want, you can have my whole house, the backyard, the sun, everything, you just don't cook anything here. Yeah? Don't cook seemingly means don't cook. I don't know, I guess you'd say the same thing, right? He didn't mean don't use the sun, he meant don't use his kitchen. I don't know if that's what Hashem meant, don't use the kitchen. One second, I just want to get to, and I'll entertain the questions in a second. What is it that's called cooking on Shabbos? If the sun, it's obviously not the result, right? Because if I will cook a little bit of an egg on fire or derivative of fire, it's a Torah penalty. Yeah? Torah, not penalty. Prohibition. If I will cook even a little bit or a lot, the whole thing if possible, in the sun, it's totally permitted and I can eat that egg or whatever it is. Go ahead.
What about sun and water that's like so prevalent around here? Are we able to use that on the Shabbos because it's being heated by the sun rather than electricity? So
in my notes, where I wrote this down, it was all to lead up to that question, but that's not the question here today. You can ask me that after. Go ahead.
What if you accidentally left orange or tomato on and you orange can raisin or tomato you can some dried tomato, even purpose of cooking you just left it in the windowsill and it changed form.
By the sun.
Repeat the question.
But you weren't specifically attempting to. Can you eat that raisin on Shabbos?
We have different problems, rabbinic problems with that. Nothing to do with cooking though. With cooking, from the perspective of cooking, you'd be allowed to eat it.
Because it changed form.
Because you put it in a place where it wouldn't. You put it in a place during the beginning of Shabbos. The law in Muksa. And no muksa, right? You put it in a place in the beginning of Shabbos where you rejected it for that time, and on Shabbos that it will be at some point it's going to become rotten, right? Before it dries out, it becomes gross. So you kind of rejected it for Shabbos, and therefore even if it would become ready on Shabbos, you're not allowed to eat it.
What about if you put it on purpose, like the sun-dried?
Because it says there's no muksa for part of a day.
Or can you eat it after Shabbos?
After Shabbos, true.
What about on purpose? People that out and dry.
Yeah, that's on Shabbos. That it will be ready on Shabbos, a little bit more complex, but still not allowed. Okay. Where are we holding here?
So the solar, what are we getting?
So we're talking about cooking with the sun, or derivative of the sun, derivative of fire. So cooking with fire was clearly a Torah prohibition. Derivative of fire, also a Torah prohibition. Cooking with the sun, all of a sudden is okay. So we're not interested in the result. We're interested in somehow the form of cooking. How you're going to cook, that's what the Torah was interested in. The result, the Torah doesn't mind if you have cooked food on Shabbos, right? It just matters how you go about doing it. Right? I don't think it's so practical that you would actually cook an egg and become an edible